Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast. This time, it is not being shot from my terrorist hideout, but from my family house in the nicest place in the world, which is Northwest Burgundy. And I have with me an excellent guest whose name is Luke Niforatos. And I hope I got that right. People
You
get
did. Very
my
good.
name great. People get my name wrong all the time, so um, I'm allowed to do it. Um, and you are remind me your title and affiliation precisely.
Certainly. I'm the executive vice president at SAM, which stands for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. We're basically the world's largest, certainly America's largest nonprofit advocacy organization that is against normalizing and commercializing marijuana.
Very cool. So how did you get into this?
Great question.
What's your background? What got you into politics in general, and what got you into this issue in particular?
Good question. I guess I'll start with the bigger picture one, which is politics, policy in general, and then I'll zero in on
Yeah.
marijuana because it's kind of an interesting trajectory for me. But basically, I grew up in a ministry family, traveling around the world doing Christian ministry work as well as refugee aid and medical aid work in war-torn countries like Sudan and Africa and elsewhere. So actually, I had a chance to go to France when I was 4 years old, and that was the first time I had ever ridden a horse, and I was terrified of horses until
That's
about
not in the list
yeah.
of war-torn countries in Africa, right?
Yes, thankfully not in the list of war-torn countries. Yes, but I traveling across the
Not
world
yet.
doing different ministry stuff, and had a chance to go to France for the when I was five. And yeah, I rode a horse, or my parents put me on a horse anyway, and I really didn't like it. So that was my memory there. But then we had to go to Nice, and Nice was lovely, and so I had a very pleasant memory of France after that. So that was good. But so that was where I started, and I think for me, and this really brought together policy and drug policy for me was that from a young age, I saw in different parts of the world the impact of policy on people and the impact of bad governance on people, particularly in the work that my family did in Africa. And
Right.
I grew
For
up
sure.
going to Uganda and Kenya and seeing the child soldiers and learning that the way that they uh, ruined these children and got them to do what they wanted them to do was by addicting
Right.
them to drugs. And that was from a young age my first interaction with seeing what drugs did to society. And
Right.
also just seeing the lack of good governance control and taking care of people in some of those areas. So, fast forward growing up, I really wanted to have an impact on policy that would make people's lives better, that would help bring about in my view, virtue in society and bring about good health in society. So I naturally kind of gravitated into healthcare. So I started out actually in healthcare. I very long story short, ended up starting a healthcare company that I sold, and so that was kind of the space I was in. But always I was involved in politics as a hobby, and so I was involved in campaigns and political endeavors, county party stuff, et cetera, in Colorado, which is where I was raised. And that's where I kind of then, being in Colorado, first state to legalize marijuana recreationally in the United States, that kind of
Uh,
brought it home for me in terms of that issue. So, I was single when we legalized it. I voted against it. Then I got married. Then I had my first little girl. I now have two little girls. But I had my first daughter, and
Congratulations.
thank you. And we're taking her for a walk in Denver, and somebody lights up a joint as she's sleeping in her stroller, and the secondhand marijuana smoke,
Right.
got into her stroller. She clearly breathed that in. And that was where it hit home for me that this is a bad policy choice. And nobody's really
Right.
telling that story. And so for me, that's why I ended up diving into this issue. So that's a lot of details compressed, but that's kind of my background and how I ended up here. I had a bachelor's from the University of Denver in communications and a master's at Johns Hopkins. And currently I'm working part time on my law degree. So that's the kind of part time personal
Very
project I'm working on.
impressive.
Thank you.
I've had, well, we're not going to talk about that, but I've had a long-standing contrarian hot take that getting a law degree if you want to have a career in DC is a mistake. Everybody tells you should do it, but I disagree. But you've done it, so it's too late. Uh,
Well, thankfully,
I
I got
have
my
a
career in DC first, and then now I'm doing law school on
yes,
the back end.
yes, yes, yes. That's better. That's better. I have a very funny story that I can't tell on air about a somewhat important Washington person who I tried to talk out of getting a law degree, and it turns out I was very, very right in very hilarious ways. Uh,
Oh, I bet.
anyway, okay, that all makes sense. You definitely have the clean cut missionary son vibe, and you also there's also a Western vibe. So it all makes sense. Okay, so one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, so this is in the news. We're recording this August 19th. There's a lot of talk about rescheduling marijuana as a drug. This is something that President Trump has said he's considering, and there's a lot of heavy lobbying, social media campaigning, and so on and so forth to get him to do that. So that's why I wanted to talk to you. We had a first interview, and it was so interesting. I wanted to do a full podcast. So explain this rescheduling issue. What does that mean? What would that entail?
Absolutely. So just to step back too, just for a second about our organization. So SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, you can check out our website, learnaboutsam.org. We have a science advisory board of people who research marijuana. We're basically the leading voice for cutting edge science when it comes to this drug. And the final thing I'll say is we're nonpartisan. So we have former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, who's a Democrat from Rhode Island, who was one of our co-founders, in addition to a whole bunch of Republicans and independents and people everywhere on every end of the extreme and in between. So that's where we cut our teeth.
Good to know.
And yeah, and so we are very concerned about this rescheduling decision because it has totally defied the precedents for how you deal with the drug scheduling. So, you asked for a little bit of the background on rescheduling. So, essentially, our country, the United States, has the Controlled Substances Act, which was passed in 1970 and signed into legislation by President Nixon. That created a five schedule system, one through five. The first big myth about drug scheduling that most people think, and it's just a total myth, so it's important to debunk it today, which is that a lot of people think that it is a harm index. So that drugs that are Schedule 1, that people think are the worst, and drugs that are Schedule 5 are the more harmless drugs. And that just is not true. The scheduling system is actually based on two basically two criteria. The first criteria is the drug's potential for abuse, so the potential for addiction, harm to your mental health, et cetera, other health issues. And then the other component is the drugs, whether or not the drug has accepted medical use according to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So those are the two components. And so depending on whether a drug has medical use, accepted medical use, or its harm profile, it'll end up on one of those elements of the schedule. So for example, marijuana Schedule 1, and we hear a lot about, marijuana shouldn't be Schedule 1 because it's not as bad as fentanyl per se. But most people will be shocked to learn that fentanyl is Schedule 2, and it's not because fentanyl is less harmful. It's because fentanyl has an accepted
Interesting.
medical use in a hospital setting. And by the way,
Uh,
yeah, and so marijuana as a raw drug is Schedule 1 because you smoke it. It has a number of harms we can get into. In addition to as a whole raw drug, it is not an approved medication. However, there are medications that have been taken from marijuana. So, for example, the component THC has been approved by the FDA in the form of Marinol. That is Schedule 2. The component CBD has been approved in the form of Epidiolex, and that is also Schedule 2. So it's a complicated picture, and so it's very oversimplified when people say, "Oh, marijuana Schedule 1. That means we'll never have it for anything, and it's the worst ever." That's not true. It's just we're never
that's
going to have
good
a
to know.
situation though where the whole
That's
drug is going to
interesting.
be rescheduled. At least not
That's
not in a way
interesting.
that makes sense with the science.
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna skip over a bunch of procedural stuff because
Okay,
that's not the most interesting stuff I want to get into. But basically, what you explained to me in our last interview was that it was actually the Biden administration that got this ball rolling.
that's
They
correct.
wanted to reschedule it, and so they started this process. Basically, if you want to reschedule a drug, you have to get a bunch of panels of experts. Blah 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 blah. Uh, but and so this got started in the Biden administration, and so it's arriving on President Trump's desk now. And so there's this whole process, but ultimately it's the president who decides, right? Ultimately, it's the president who says yes or no. Um, uh, what would it mean in practice if marijuana was rescheduled? Because it's like, okay, like, is it, is it a line on a form? Is it a check mark? Is it just symbolism, or would it have significant implications in the real world?
It's essentially everything you just said. So first of all, the symbolism, yes, it's going to send a message to the rest of the country that the government had it wrong to start. It never should have been Schedule One. It's not that bad of a drug. And so the message to the kids and to the broader public is going to be that marijuana is not that harmful. And so we're obviously very concerned about the message moving marijuana from Schedule One to Three would have. Not the least of which because from a policy perspective and a technical perspective, it just doesn't make sense. But beyond the symbolism of it, there's also a very concrete thing that it would do. It would essentially blow the doors open on this entirely federally illegal marijuana industry by giving them a giant tax break. So right now, because they're Schedule One and they're federally illegal, they do not get access
Okay,
to write off their.
explain the tax thing precisely, because it's
Yes,
important, and
yes.
tax stuff is always complicated.
Yes. So there is in very simple terms, there's the 280E exemption. So for drugs that are Schedule One, there's an element of the tax code called 280E that prevents Schedule One drugs, companies selling Schedule One drugs from getting a write-off on their business expenses like advertising, payroll, etc. If marijuana moves to Schedule 3, it is no longer subject to 280E, and therefore the entire industry will, we estimate, receive more than $2 billion per year in tax breaks. So what that would mean is the industry
That's
would,
huge.
the industry would jump overnight. I mean, that's why they're investing so much money in doing this, which we can talk about a little bit later. But that's why they care about this. It would keep them illegal. That's the weird thing. It would keep the industry totally federally illegal. But what it would do is it would give them a giant tax break and they would grow. They would be able to advertise these products more. They would actually receive tax write offs for their products that are relentlessly targeting kids, the gummy bears, the candies, the ice creams that everyone's seeing right now, these extreme products that are targeting kids and hurting kids. People are being poisoned by them, etc. They would actually get rewarded for that behavior through this act, which I think is what our largest concern is with the decision. And so I think there's some people that say, well, this is a little policy lever we're pulling. It doesn't actually legalize it. Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe it's a good compromise. But the problem is when you give the industry that tax break, you're in effect broadening and expanding the legalization of marijuana through financial incentive that you're giving the industry.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, uh, let's get to the meat of the rescheduling decision is actually a big deal. Like, it seems like this sort of bureaucratic, symbolic, but it's actually a big deal because it would essentially, so it wouldn't legalize the industry, but it would at the same time give it a blank check, or a kind of seal of, it would give them like directly a bunch of money, but it would sort of give them a seal of approval that would mean they would have, it would be easier for them to raise money, find investors, do advertising, and so on and so forth. So it would be a
It
huge
essentially
boom.
incentivizes all the worst things we're seeing in the news. The
Yeah.
things that people really, everyone objectively hates, the advertising, the cartoon characters, the gummies, all that stuff totally incentivized with this move. And in addition to it, one other thing I'll add is that we're not just talking about corporations that would be using this. What we're learning is that in places like Maine, Oklahoma, Michigan, California, there are illegal Chinese and other foreign cartels that are actually taking full control of state regulated marijuana businesses. And I say state regulated because they're not being
Right.
inspected. There's no kind of enforcement happening. We're finding out that these businesses are actually cartel fronts. And so, what is in effect going to happen is that tax break is
Okay,
going to
okay,
be
okay.
used by these cartels.
Slow down.
Yeah.
Cartel fronts. So explain this to me. How do we know this?
So, what we've seen is some testimony from the Drug Enforcement Administration before Congress, in addition to a large number of reports coming out of Maine and Oklahoma. And it's from all the major media agencies. And what they're estimating, according to law enforcement on the ground in these states, is that these, what the companies that the state is licensing for medical or recreational marijuana grows or for the storefronts that are selling these products. These companies are actually being run by foreign cartels. In fact, in Maine, the top marijuana regulator in Maine openly admitted on the record, said, we know that Chinese cartels are the ones that own these operations submitting the license applications, but the policy that we have in Maine for approving these licenses does not allow us to reject them. So they're actually knowingly granting these cartels licenses to sell legally marijuana in their state, which is crazy.
Wonderful.
And what we're seeing is then, so once you have a cartel that has ownership of a structure like that, they then begin to launder money into the American financial system. And so what
Right.
we've learned is there's fentanyl money that's being laundered, there's human trafficking money that's being laundered, all with the cover of marijuana legalization. And so I think, you look more broadly at the problem. When you start legalizing drugs, it doesn't matter if you think we can regulate it so well, et cetera. Crime accompanies drug use and behavior. That's why, from a policy perspective, we cannot normalize drug use in our country, even if we think the drug is not that big of a deal. And what you do is you bring in cover for very bad, very nefarious actors, whether you like it or not. And that is exactly what's happening with marijuana right now.
We're gonna get into that. So, have you ever watched the show Tulsa King?
No, I don't think I have.
Well, you should because it's about that. So it's Sylvester Stallone, who is now President Trump's ambassador to Hollywood, the People's Republic over there. Um, it's a very good show, and the premise. So he plays this like mobster, who's New York mobster, who's exiled to Tulsa, and he becomes a local kingpin. Anyway, that like there's an entire arc that's about this. There's an entire arc that's about marijuana legalization and so on and so forth.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to
And
watch it.
using it as a sort of money laundering. And spoiler alert, plug your ears, but like this is eventually what you find out, which is like the rival who runs the marijuana farm, who he thinks is just some shady businessman, turns out to be a front for like Chinese cartels who are like just
Yeah, that's
extremely
actually true. That's
dangerous.
actually what's happening.
Yes. So I mean, I I mean, I watched this and I was like, "Oh, that's a funny, that's a funny plot, interesting premise. That's a funny plot point." And it's like, "Oh, actually, it's true. It's true to life." And I'm sure that's not innocent because Stallone is I'm a huge fan. He's a very intelligent guy, very highly cultured, and he's a conservative, and he's probably seen the damages of drugs in Hollywood. He's the executive producer of the show, so now that I know, it feels very intentional. So yeah, so you should definitely watch that show, and it's
I'll
a good
definitely
show.
be watching it.
Um, okay. Uh, so let's dig into the broader policy discussion. Putting aside the rescheduling thing, like what should informed citizens and policymakers think about marijuana? Give me the case for why, we shouldn't legalize it, we shouldn't normalize it, we should uh, crack down, and if so, to what extent? That I'll ask. But like, first of all, why is it bad? Why is it so bad?
Great question. So I'm going to start off with the market capture piece of this because I think that's the big picture concern here. And I know you're an expert on markets and using markets for good. So I'll be curious to know if you have any feedback or thoughts on this. But what I will say is that our biggest concern is not so much with the drug itself. And not to say that the drug isn't inherently harmful, because it is inherently harmful. We have 50,000 plus research studies on the drug over the last few decades that indicate that it's harmful, but more so because we look at the history of tobacco. So more than 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, people were smoking pipe tobacco, and we didn't have the millions of deaths and the cancers and the widespread public health carnage from the use of tobacco more than 100 years ago. What changed around 100 years ago? Well, we had the invention of the cigarette, We had a large corporate conglomerate model that took over cigarettes. We had the global supply chain. We had the massive distribution, the advertising, the paid research, and everything else that happened with tobacco. And that's what made the cigarette the number one global killer in the world, and millions of people dying from it, and cancers, et cetera. So that the key critical moment in the history of tobacco was the commercialization of tobacco. It was when it went from a localized thing that perhaps people grew and just kind of consumed occasionally, went from that to commercialized thing that's being pushed for people to use every single day, and not just every single day but many times per day. And it had additives and all those things that happen with cigarettes. Let's look at what's happening with marijuana. This is why we're very worried about marijuana legalization, why we're very worried about any kind of drug legalization, is we're seeing the exact same playbook happen with marijuana. The tobacco industry, Altria, which is the new name for Philip Morris, they've poured more than $2 billion into the marijuana industry. You have other global tobacco companies that are involved now as well. And we know from the master settlement.
It's sad to see such a good company with such a wholesome product get
Oh,
into
yes. That
a
loves the
nasty
American
industry
family and has invested so
like
much in our
marijuana.
well-being. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah, it's very sad, isn't it?
yeah, no, that's real. That's really funny. That's real. Okay, go on.
So uh, they're invested. Big alcohol's invested. People say, "Oh, alcohol's the alcohol industry," and we see what they're doing. And the alcohol industry is also invested. In addition to, and it's very funny, Pascal, because we get accused of, "Oh, you're evil, big pharma. You just don't want medical marijuana to get out there." And it's like, well, actually, the pharma companies are invested in this too. So all the
Oh
major
yeah,
drug addiction
like
companies are, yeah,
yeah. Because, like, I mean, if you're, Pfizer or one of the big pharma companies, your lawyers will never let you get into marijuana sale and distribution. And so, you want this stuff to be legalized so you can swallow up so you can come in with your like huge financial guns and swallow up the market. So, yeah, that's that thing, and it's like it's not the 70s, man, anymore. Like
no.
it's no longer like hippies smoking. It's like, oh, you're for the man. It's like, no,
No, the
like,
man wants to legalize marijuana now. It's
yes,
the man
yes,
who's pushing
yes,
this, not
yes,
the
yes,
revolution. Uh-huh.
yes,
So those are the folks that are involved. And so marijuana went from a drug that was on average in a state of nature, if we're to believe that, in the state of nature in America somewhere,
right,
it was growing, 2 to 3% potency THC max. That's the ingredient that gets people
right,
high.
right,
Now the plant has been modified, it's been bred to get up to, now the flower, the plant itself gets up to about 30 to 35% THC. That's something that is not natural. It's never been that way. It is much more potent. And then we're seeing concentrates now, these extracts, these chemical creations from the plant that are up to 99% potency. So whatever we thought about marijuana back in the day, and you were talking about hippies, they had no idea about this marijuana. This is a totally different drug. So the harms, which, interestingly enough, you look at the history, for example, like Mexico, a lot of people think America, evil, racist. We were the ones that led the charge to ban marijuana because we were racist against Black and brown communities. And certainly there were some racist intentions back in those days. But if you look at it historically, the first country in North America to prohibit marijuana was Mexico. And it was because they were seeing the increase in cases of mental health crises, psychosis, crime, all the things that they saw with the expansion of marijuana use. We then followed suit. Okay. And so there was a lot of evidence then of the mental health connection, even at a low potency. But now, with the 99% potency products, with the very highly potent products, the link is now causal
okay.
between using marijuana and mental illness.
We'll talk about the health effects because it's very important. Like the evidence is just sort of like arriving like an avalanche. It's easier to make studies when you have lots a lot more test subjects. Um,
Yes, unfortunately.
yeah, I just want to zero in on what you said about the sort of market dynamics,
Yes.
because this is something that's been shown in a lot of research, and this is true in all of the quote unquote vice industries, which is the late Mark Kleiman, who was at UCLA and then NYU, who's a very famous academic who studied this sort of stuff. Um, Basically, he sort of demonstrated that those companies' business model requires or relies on creating addicts, and you see this with gambling, where all of the online gambling companies, they make money from so-called whales, who are not people who you know gamble like a 20, $50 once in a while, which is fun and no problem, but like people who lose their life savings, lose their
Right.
lives. um, Beer companies, same thing, and so on and so forth. So this point is very important, because like we know that this also happens in every other industry like this. So we know it is going to happen, or it is happening now, if it is legalized. So I just wanted to stop there, and then we'll go into the health effects,
Yes. I have a
because
few
that
points
is
to add to
also
that.
huge. Yeah, sure.
So yeah, you're getting at what we call the addiction for profit model. And Kleiman is a longtime friend of the CEO of my organization, Kevin Sabet. They didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on the industry capture being a problem. And they had disagreement about how best to deal with that. Kleiman, in some ways, supported types of legalization, but he had the skepticism
Yeah,
that I think we all share about this. And, in essence, and it's interesting because Kleiman talked about one way to deal with the way to deal with the industry capture, the addiction for profit side of things, would be to address the biggest players and basically have enforcement, particularly in like areas where there's illegal drug markets, against the worst perpetrators in order to
right.
scatter them. And basically decrease the saturation of the drug's availability. And I actually wrote about that in my thesis at Johns Hopkins for my master's on this subject, looking at how you could actually enforce federal law in a way that makes sense against this very large marijuana industry. So it's worth looking into. But no, Klein was absolutely right. There is this addiction for profit model, and it's, as you were relating, these companies. I don't know what their intentions are, but their incentives are very clearly public. They are legally defined. You have to return an investment to your shareholders. You have to return
Right.
profits to your shareholders. That's a for-profit company. And that works very well, obviously, in a free market society when you're creating innovations that help people and make things easier. But the incentive is to make things easy to use, easy to access, and delightful.
Yeah.
That's basically how the market is supposed to work around products. And we see the beautiful benefits of that. However, there is a dark side to it. And that dark side is when drugs get into the mix, because the incentive is to take the drug and do exactly what we saw with cigarettes: make it easy to use, make it cheaper, make it very delightful, make it a ritual. That's the whole idea. And so when it's an addictive drug, it's catastrophic. And we're seeing the same thing with marijuana now, where now you have the vaping devices. They can turn marijuana into these oils. They have
Yep.
flavors. They have new ways of consuming it. And so
This
now,
is this is marijuana, by the way. No, I'm joking.
I was going to say, I have a feeling not. You look too sharp and with it to be doing that.
Yes, yes,
Uh,
I'm alert, so it can't
Very
be.
much so. So, you look at the model of profit for these folks. They are not incentivized to say, you know what, you're hitting
Yep.
the dab. You're dabbing marijuana too many times per day. You come in here 3 times to buy more marijuana products. You got to stop. They're not incentivized to do that. They're incentivized to keep selling
Yeah.
it to you. And so, with the alcohol industry, 10% of alcohol consumers in America make up more than 80% of the industry's profits. That's addiction for profit 101. And the same thing's playing out in legal marijuana states like Colorado, where 10% of Colorado marijuana users make up more than 70% of the consumption there, too. So it's heavy, addicted users that are driving the profits for this industry. And it has no reason to stop that. And we as a country have really not figured out a way to stop that either from happening, because it's just the basics of supply and demand and consumption and the way that commodities work. And that is why I think our previous generations had the foresight to say, we are going to keep drugs out of the market, because if they are in the
Yeah.
market, it's going to be catastrophic. And we saw that with cigarettes. We're seeing that with alcohol continued, and we saw that with OxyContin and opioids. And so I think we're seeing that same model play out with marijuana, and I'm very concerned about it.
Okay, so let's talk about the health effects. This is like there's this avalanche of new studies that are coming in. So it's much more potent, which makes it much more addictive. And if you consume regularly, you have a much increased risk of schizophrenia and psychosis. And there's you can never get you can never get the full information in these things, but there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that many of the sort of mass shootings that we've seen, in particular with young people, were caused by cannabis-induced psychosis. Um, okay, well, I mean, talk about that a little bit. And is there anything else we should know that's alarming? That somebody who uh, fell into a coma in like 2005, uh, was getting high in college in 2005,
Right.
fell into a coma, woke up now, wouldn't know about pot that we now know and its impact on
Yeah.
health.
As you said, the potency skyrocketed. It changed the harm profile of the drug. And so, if anything, it's gotten more dangerous over the last decade, not less dangerous. So, if you thought marijuana was harmless back in the day, it's not anymore. And obviously, the biggest area of research that we're seeing unfold and the biggest concern that health experts have is the correlation with mental illness, schizophrenia, psychosis. People hear that and they think that's crazy. But again, you have to understand this drug is not the same drug you know it to be. It is also not a natural drug. There's this movement with the RFKs of the world to say, like, let's have like the all natural stuff, natural
Right,
alternatives to
right, right.
pharmaceuticals.
That's a good
And as soon
point.
as,
Yes.
yeah, people understand this is not a natural alternative to pharmaceuticals. This is a genetically modified, engineered alternative
Oh,
now
and
that loads
by the
that.
way, the schizophrenia and psychosis are irreversible, right?
Correct. That's correct.
So,
Especially if you're
if
starting young,
you're
it's
addicted to
yeah.
heroin and you get off heroin, over time your health will recover. But if you get schizophrenia from pot, then you will have it for the rest of your life, and you may be able to manage it with medication, because now there are pretty good medications with for schizophrenia. But like, you have it for the rest of your life. Like, your brain is damaged
In
for the
many
rest of
cases,
your life.
yes. Yes. And and I think that so the mental illness link is obviously very concerning for a wide array of reasons, not the least of which the idea that we have, the largest the fastest increasing cohort in this country of people who are using marijuana are the people from 18 to 25. That's the age cohort that's using it the most
Yes.
right now. And that is a cohort that their brains are still developing all the way up to 25. So we are seeing that mental illness link is much more you can see it much more demonstrated in the literature for people that are younger and their brains are still developing. And those are the folks that are coming forward into the workplace. Those are the folks that are going to drive the future for this country. So that's very concerning when you think about that link. And so I think for folks that are out there and say, well, what about alcohol? Alcohol is so bad for you. Alcohol is bad for you in many ways. It does not lead you into mental illness in this way. It does not have this kind of an impact on your mental state, your ability to perceive reality, as
Yes,
well
alcohol is
as
another good example. Like, if you're an alcoholic and you get sober, like, you're fine. You're fine.
to
After
some,
a
I mean,
few
you say
months,
every drug can have lasting
physically at
impacts.
least,
But
you're
yes,
fully recovered. Right. This is not true with this. It's very important.
correct,
Okay, so
correct, and
there's
your
something.
IQ. That's the other thing. Alcohol doesn't destroy
Yes.
your IQ the way that marijuana does as well. So
Okay,
if
so
you're a youth and you're using it, you
I
lose your
wanted to
IQ.
ask that. Like, what do we have evidence on this, and what type of
Yes,
evidence is it? Because
very rock
you
solid
know,
evidence.
okay,
Go
well,
ahead.
get into it, because I'm a studies nerd, and I obviously, our sharpest and most eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed that I kind of agree with you on this topic. But
Uh,
I want to make sure that the evidence is the best evidence. Um, and of course, you could get studies to make say all sorts of things. So explain this.
Yeah, so there's a very large longitudinal study that was done a few decades ago that still is one of the most highly cited studies, and there's other ones that back it up. But I believe it was in the journal. I want to say it was Journal of Psychology or Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the two. Very large longitudinal study followed people using marijuana, and what they found was you are going to have a permanent IQ loss of 4 to 6 points if you're starting marijuana use in your youth and using it regularly. And that 4 to 6 point IQ loss is permanent. So you are going from somebody who goes from A minus to like a C plus that's the equivalent in terms of your intelligence, and that's permanent. And I think a lot of people think that's ridiculous, but I mean it's just the facts of the facts. I mean this is quality research that's being done on this subject. We also have a lot of research studies that are done on academic performance for high school and college students who are regularly using marijuana. And obviously, it's not surprising. We're seeing lower test scores, lower GPA, a lower or higher absenteeism from school. Also, that, by the way, applies in the work setting too. So people who are using marijuana and they're in their place of work have higher rates of absenteeism also. So it is a drug that impacts your overall performance, your overall intelligence. And I think that's concerning when you look at the way we're trying to compete in the global economy. You have countries like China, for example, that completely zero tolerance. They don't want their public using any of this stuff. They want maximum performance out of their people. And obviously, they're an
I
extreme
remember
case to
the
the other
Opium
side.
War.
But yeah, they remember the Opium War. And by the way, speaking of the Opium Wars, you could make an argument that I don't know that the government of China is paying it forward in this way, but I don't think it's lost on people in China that these Chinese cartels and other folks that are enabling the transfer of fentanyl and marijuana, et cetera, be pushing that in our country. That is in a way kind of paying us back for some history there. I think that there's some people in China where that's not lost on them. They are returning that war
Oh, a hundred
onto our
percent, a
country,
hundred percent.
and we as a
It's
country
deliberate
are
strategy.
absolutely, because they saw what it did, and we you see what it's doing to our
Yep.
country now. In many ways, you could argue that a lot of people in this country, America, do not have a good grip on reality. Quite frankly, that they're seeking an escape. Our decadence has led us, I think, in many ways as a country to seek escape from the problems that we perceive, from things that make us feel uncomfortable. And there's a lot of isolation now in our society for many reasons we could get into. And I think the pushing of these drugs is there's a number of people that are accepting them, and then it's driving problems politically because I think there are folks in government who
Yep.
see that issue, but you have now swaths of the electorate who have been swept up by drug addiction, and that's something we have to deal with. Not the least of which for national security, but also for the
Yeah.
family and I think the health of our society.
Yeah. Okay. So I have one question, and then we'll talk about crime, and then I'll ask you a few devil's advocate questions. Um, so there's I wonder what your thoughts on this are, and if literature or studies on this. And there's this phenomenon, and it's hard to describe. So we all know a pothead. Like we all know a guy who smokes too much pot, and like it's clearly had a negative effect on his brain. Okay. We read these studies. If you are a heavy pot user, you're at the increased risk of these really of schizophrenia and psychosis. And so, okay, there is a type of person, and I know a couple examples. They're regular pot users. They're not dysfunctional. They have families, they have a job which they do okay at or well, and it can be like important jobs. But it's really hard to sort of put a finger on it. They're a little bit slower, frankly. They're a little bit detached, but also like you know their projects sort of never pan out. There's a kind of you know it's like it puts you on slow mode, and the problem is these people. Okay, maybe you could see a small IQ effect, but like if you look at them statistically as units in statistics, uh, you know, they have a family, they have a job, they're not involved in criminality, and so on and so forth. You would say, just looking at the paper, oh, well, this is somebody who's regularly using pot and is fine. They're not, mentally ill, and so on and so forth. But there is this thing, and you could say, oh, well, if you want to you know, reduce all of your stats by 10%, okay, that's fine. But like if you multiply that by millions of people in a country, um, it's a societal disaster. So do you see the phenomenon? I was talking about this with a friend, and like we agreed, and we even agreed on the particular individuals that we were thinking of. Um, uh, do you see the phenomenon that I'm talking about? And if so, does it have a name? Have there studies been done trying to like identify this? Because I'm asking because just I'm curious, but also it's like it's very perverse because it doesn't cause the same kind of destruction that
I agree.
somebody who sells his car to buy booze or something. Yeah, that's my
So I,
question.
I definitely have personal anecdotes and people that I knew and know currently that have that impact, and people who now are in recovery from marijuana use that acknowledge that there's a permanent impact on them where they do have that. They're a little slower to the punch. Their memory is not quite as good. They know that that's tied to their heavy marijuana use, and so I don't know if I've seen that. I'm sure it's in the literature. I've never seen that. It's interesting you bring that up because I brought that up before as well. So I'll have to do some research on that and get back to you if there's some research that's been done on that
So
phenomenon
somebody
specifically.
needs to study it. Somebody needs to call it like marijuana, slow down,
Right. But
reduced
I think what it
capacity.
generally
It's not
is,
just slowing
yeah.
down because slowing down is like the most visible thing. I think about it every time I watch Rogan, for example.
Ah, yeah.
I'm like, you're obviously an extremely successful person. Like you're making,
Right.
$20 million a year. And you're great at what you do. Like he's an excellent podcast host, as someone who's in the biz. Uh, but but like anyway,
You can
so
tell.
it's not
Well,
just
and
but
I
it's
also, I,
not
I
just
always think of
slowing
Lil
down because
Wayne
that's the
also.
most visible. It's a sort of pervasive sort of,
Right.
it's like a player in an RPG has got stats on, everything, and it's just like you take 5 to 10% down on everything.
Right.
It's very
And what I
strange. So
think about
somebody
that is,
name it and study
yeah.
it.
And what I think about that is, Pascal, is the population level impact of that. Because there are people who will say, well,
Yep.
that's not a big deal, 10% slower. Like I think about Lil Wayne. Lil Wayne's my example I go to because he used to say he doesn't even write his lyrics. He remembers all of his songs by heart. But then, and he's a heavy marijuana user among other drugs. But interestingly, he had a quote just a few months ago, and here I'm giving my hip hop street cred. But a few months ago, he said he doesn't remember any of his songs anymore. He couldn't even tell you if a song was his or not. And so it's kind of like you wait long term to see what the impact is of heavy drug use,
Right.
and then you see it, which I think is important to understand. And it's very
Right.
sad in his case. But what I will say is, I look at this from a population perspective. And you say, okay, we take that down 10%. We say, okay, you're going to lose your short term memory. No big deal. You're going to be a little bit slower to the punch. No big deal. You're going to have all these other mental issues. You're going to have other health issues, cardiovascular issues, etc. Not everybody's going to have extreme impacts, but maybe, like you said, it's kind of a
Yeah.
moderate lowering of your performance. But if I look at that across and we say we get, let's say, I mean, obviously the industry wants everybody to be using. That's their whole idea.
Yes.
So let's say we go to the level of alcohol with marijuana, where 60% of Americans are using it on a regular basis. If you have
Right.
60% of this country regularly using a drug with these known effects, that is
Yeah.
not going to set you up to be successful in work, that is not
Yeah.
going to set you up to be a responsible father or mother or somebody in responsibility in other situations. That is a very scary scenario because then you're talking about taking
Yeah.
the overarching performance of our country, the overarching
Yeah.
moral fiber of our country, first of all. Second of all, the overarching economic output and security ability of our country. You're taking
Yeah.
it down a notch. That to me
Yeah.
is very concerning.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk marijuana and crime, because again, this is something on which the evidence has come in and sort of, to my mind, decisively settled the debate. Certainly, you look at Europe. Basically, the story is that it turns out it actually is a gateway drug, and so when you legalize marijuana, you increase demand not just for marijuana, but for more potent forms of marijuana that may be still regulated or illegal, right? Because that's the argument. Oh, we're going to legalize it, but we're going to regulate it. Okay, well,
Right.
eventually the guys want the stronger stuff.
Yes.
Um, or just other drugs that are illegal. And so, actually, like you create criminality. The example I'm most familiar with is the Netherlands, which was held up as like the utopia of like pot coffee shops, and now their
Now it's totally
prosecutors.
changed.
Yeah, the public prosecutor's office literally describes the country as a narco state. And it's well known that the port of Antwerp, which is the biggest port in Europe, through which like 20% of the world's shipping or something insane like that, is controlled by the Moroccan mafia because all the pot sold in Europe is grown in Morocco. And like, I mean, there are like it's like reading about Colombia in the 80s, like, guys running the customs office at the port of Antwerp, being told that, they'll never see their family again if they don't look the other
Right.
way, and so on and so forth. In the Netherlands, in this like magnificent, borderline utopic country of beautiful architecture, nice people, productive, functional, and so on and so forth. Portugal is the other example. They have
Yes.
a huge rash of overdose deaths, in particular, because they did the safe injection thing, which is separate from cannabis, but it speaks to this thing it's really about human nature, which is that if you enable our bad traits, they get worse. Which
Yeah, I think
it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. And so, you know, safe injection sites, they don't lead to people, injecting the same amount, but with safe needles. They lead to people injecting more and dying of overdoses. Um, yeah, and there is some stuff in the U.S. My friend Charles Lehman, who I would assume you know or know of at the
yep,
Manhattan
he's a very good
Institute,
friend.
who's been a guest here, did an article about studies in Oregon and Washington where same thing. Um, I guess I don't have a question because I went on my rant.
No, I think
But
there's
no, if
I think just yeah.
it's important. Sorry, just finishing this point, because it's like the thing about schizophrenia and so on and so forth. It's like, it turns out Nancy Reagan was right. It turns out, like, now the evidence is in, and pot really makes you dumb. It really is, at least for some people, addictive, and if you get addicted, it will really, like, actually, like, f up your life, number one. And number two, it really is a gateway drug, which really enables, like, the much worse criminality, um, that it does. And again, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence is in. Like, as far as I'm concerned, and anybody who disagrees with this is either not aware of the latest evidence or is lying.
You're absolutely right. The evidence is in, and I think just even going to the ground level, you talk to people, and I don't think it doesn't surprise your average person with basic intelligence that if you bring drugs into your community, it's going to increase crime. Like, I don't think that that's a shocking proposition to most people in this country, and so I think it really does we have to get back to common sense when it comes to policy. Like, you can call it legal and regulated all you want, but if you're going to expand recreational drug use in a neighborhood, crime's going to go up. So the research shows that University of Colorado did a research study on every community in Colorado that allowed marijuana shops into their neighborhood, saw increases in property crime of over 1,000% in a number of these neighborhoods that allowed them. We're seeing that reflected in other places as well. And then obviously the cartel activity that we talked about. But I think, I really like what you're saying about Portugal and Oregon, about this idea that if you have a permissive drug culture, that it's going to create problems from a crime perspective, from life quality of life perspective, from the life of people who are addicted perspective. I mean, everyone's hurt. And I think it comes down to a philosophy. The philosophy of policy around drugs has to start with prevention. It has to then, if you're going to, so you want to start with prevention to prevent addiction and drug use before it starts. It's not going to be perfect. You're never going to stop every single person from using drugs, just like you're not going to stop every single person from committing crime. But the idea is to restrict it, prohibit it, discourage it, keep it as low as possible in terms of availability of these drugs. And then on the back end, for the people who do slip through the cracks, for the people who do use marijuana or other substances, is to have a philosophy of recovery for those people. So meet them where they're at, but don't leave them there. Get them into recovery so that they can be free from addiction and they can achieve their greatest potential. I think that's got to be the philosophy. Is it? And you can't have this philosophy like what we saw with Portugal and also in Oregon, where you had a essentially saying, okay, we're going to decriminalize the use of drugs. We're going to say that this is generally okay with certain restrictions. Portugal, by the way, I mean, there was a lot of mischaracterization of what Portugal did. They actually had a very restrictive environment with an administrative state that does not exist in the United States, that penalized you pretty heavily for using drugs. It didn't put you in jail, but there were a lot of penalties if you were a drug user in Portugal. But even there, even with that, slight reduction in the criminal penalties, still having a restrictive state on these drugs, but that reduction at first people said, oh, it's working out great. No one's getting, ODing. They're seeing great results. There's not seeing an increase in drug use. Now, though, in the last couple of years, Portugal is seeing a total reversal of those trends. So it'll be very interesting to see in the long run. But I think we see enough from Oregon to Portugal to know that when you liberalize, normalize, expand drug use, and whatever the drug is, you have problems. And a lot of that comes with
Yep.
crime. Because frankly, when people's mind states are altered, when they're using drugs that can cause psychosis and other things like marijuana, you're more likely to commit crimes. I don't know any other way to put it.
Yep. All right. A couple devil's advocate questions. Okay, so what you see behind me is my membership diploma for a famous French wine drinking society. Um, you know, why is alcohol legal? And by the way, we can skip over that one quickly because it annoys me so much.
It's annoying for sure.
And by the way, the again sitting here in Burgundy, the cultural aspect is like the fact that the cultural argument is never mentioned. Like the very simple example of why alcohol should be legal and pot not is because my ancestors drank alcohol and they didn't smoke pot. And there's a scientific basis to that, by the way, which is that for certainly for Western European populations, we have co-evolved with alcohol for millennia. Like when Native American populations first got access to alcohol, it was a disaster because they never encountered that substance as a population. Um, but Europeans have, you could talk about the ravages of alcohol, and they're very real. Of course, I'm not trying to minimize them, but while we were drinking, we still, put men on the moon, and invented supersonic air. Like all those guys were drinking. Uh, None like 0.00. They weren't drunk while doing it, although sometimes you wonder. But they like none of them were teetotalers, or like 0.0001% were like Mormons or whatever. Um, so clearly, like that's clearly we do manage it. Um, yeah, again, I've answered my own question, but I guess the broader argument is sort of like personal responsibility, liberty, and so on and so forth. Like okay, maybe you're right. Then let's slap warning labels on all the pot products, saying, hey, if you use this, you have an increased risk of blah blah blah, like we did with tobacco. Let's tax it, let's so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if somebody's a grown adult and they want to use this arguably harmful but also a pleasant substance, they should have that right. This is America. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, my answer is a little bit of what you generally what you said, but adding a little bit to it. So yes, we made I would call it a deal with the devil with alcohol, thousands of years ago, where, and it is interesting. Again, this just getting into history, 2000 years ago, the wine that Jesus was drinking and he created with for his first miracle, right? That wine was probably nothing like the wine of today. There was probably a lot less alcohol content in it, a lot less alcohol content in the alcohol beverages over history than there is now. The alcohol that the average user is consuming now, I think, is a lot more potent. There's a lot more inebriation that's happening. But I think the key distinction here is we made a deal with the devil where the vast majority of Western civilization drinks at least occasionally. That 60% of Americans drink on a regular basis. Not saying that that's good for public health. I mean, alcohol is responsible for 100,000 American deaths a year. We're learning more about its cancer impacts. So I personally think society's better off without alcohol, but that's a battle that we're not going to fight. It's something that it's a decision we made. But additionally, what I would say is not only is it ingrained in Western civilization where marijuana was not, which I think you made interesting points on that matter. Also, you can use alcohol without getting intoxicated. You can use alcohol for the purpose of pairing it with a meal, for example, where the
Right.
idea is not to get intoxicated. The
Right.
entire reason you're using marijuana is to get intoxicated. There's no such
Right.
thing as, smoking a tiny little bit of weed bud so
Right.
that like it's in you because you love the flavor. There's that
Right.
is not happening. You're using it
Right.
to get intoxicated. And by the way, that's the Christian argument against using marijuana as well. Like, I have a lot of Christians that ask me, what is the Bible doesn't say anything about marijuana. Well, the Bible says don't get drunk, which I think we can infer means don't get intoxicated. And when you're
Right.
using marijuana, the idea is to get intoxicated, which is exactly what the Bible warns against. So I think for folks practicing Christian faith, I think that answers that very quickly. And but I think to the immediate point though, you're talking about something where with alcohol, you can have it normalized where people are not getting intoxicated. It's not having these downstream harms of intoxication. With marijuana, if you get 60% of Americans using marijuana as they do alcohol, you're going to have a lot more intoxication in society because that is the sole purpose of using it. So I think that distinguishes between the two substances. And there's just really no way to regulate that. There's no way to say, we
Right.
see in this country that once you get a foothold, you become legal, you own everything. I mean, people look at tobacco and they say, this is a great example of how, we regulated and dealt with the industry. No, it's not. People don't understand. That Congress, there's a First Amendment right that extends to corporations. If tobacco wanted to, they could be advertising on TV today. The only reason that they're not is because of a master settlement, a lawsuit where Congress got them to blink and
Right.
basically agree not to do it. There was no authority that has been vested in Congress to stop the tobacco
Right.
industry from doing what it's doing because under the Constitution, they have every right to addict everyone they want, to advertise to everyone they want.
Right.
So this idea that we can force this industry, the marijuana industry and any other addiction for profit industry to behave
That's
the way we want them
that's a
to,
very good
they
point.
have the right to behave however they want. And people have to die in order to get to sue them to get them to stop some of their activities. So I think it's really important we understand that history.
Okay. So, second devil's advocate question. This one is about enforcement, and it sort of pairs with a question about prescription. And so the devil's advocate version is it's kind of what you said. Like, it's like maybe society would be better off without alcohol, but it's here. It's a part of life. It's part of culture. There's zero political capital for getting rid of it. So let's just live with it. Maybe do things at the margin to sort of reduce the health impacts or reduce consumption and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, let's just accept that it's part of our lives. And, somebody could say the same thing about pot. Like, it's part of the culture in America. There's millions of people using it. Um, it's been that way for decades. It's been rampant for decades. There's very little political capital for the kind of law enforcement crackdown. I think, or maybe you disagree, but realistically, um, like President Trump is not going to send the feds to like arrest 19-year-olds smoking pot um, and send them to prison. And maybe he should, but he's just not going to. Um, so that's the devil's advocate question, which leads into naturally, like, okay, like, what would you like to see given? And maybe your answer is like, I don't care about those political constraints because the alternative is like, melting the brains of every 20-year-old in America. So we just got to do what we got to do. It's just fine. But what do you think is the what would you like the policy regime, the enforcement regime to be, uh, given sort of realistic 2025 America constraints? That's
Great
a very
questions.
long two-parter question.
Yeah, first of all, let me deal with your premise of the first question. So I don't agree that it is ingrained into American culture in a way that's comparable with alcohol. I think that certainly there's pop culture, a lot of marijuana references over the last couple of decades, certainly, particularly in music and things of that nature, some writings. Certainly, marijuana has obviously always been around. But what I will say is, you look at the use data, that the federal surveys on use levels of drugs, which there's only data that we have on this subject, so it's all I can work with. We're still talking about 10 to 15% of Americans are regularly using marijuana today. So, yes, that's not an insignificant number, but it's also very far from even half or a majority of this country that's
Right.
using it on a regular basis. So, in my mind, as a policymaker, it's a totally different policy question if you come to me and say 60% of Americans are using marijuana on a regular basis. Then it's a totally different policy question at that point. But
Right.
we're not there. But where we are is that there's, yes, and there are people probably even laughing right now, like, oh, I know everyone uses marijuana. Certainly 50% of people in this country have tried it. I'm not saying
Right.
that most people haven't tried it or seen it around, but most people use it one or two or three times and then they're done. They
Right.
don't use it ever again.
Right.
And so I think that's a very important thing to understand. We are not at a place as a nation where we
Yeah,
have to
because by the way,
accept
it
this.
sucks.
Yes, most people think that. Most people think it's not good. They don't enjoy it. That is, by and large, the reaction to it. But we're talking about 30% of people who use it in the last year will
Yep.
develop an addiction. So that's the part
Yep.
that we're concerned about. So that's the premise of your first question I wanted to address. Secondarily, in terms of enforcement, what we'd like to see happen, we as an organization are not interested in criminalizing use. So somebody's small possession, somebody's use in their own home, that's something that we would like to see discouraged, but we don't want people going to prison for that. Our concern is with the commercialization, the sale, the promotion, the normalization of these drugs. And I think that is where there actually is potentially some political capital to do something about it. We are actually working on two stealth projects at the state level. I can't say exactly what it is, but they're going to give voters another choice. I'll just leave it at that, and more to come on those announcements later. And maybe we can do another interview later about that. But there is pushback politically at the state level on some of these states that have legalized marijuana, particularly around the smell, the smoke, the stores, the advertising, the products, all the things that we've talked about today. And so I do think that you could have a targeted approach looking at the biggest players. And again, I mentioned my capstone I wrote for Johns Hopkins, and this is what I talk about: is you start with the biggest, worst behaved, and this is something Kleiman I think would agree with, biggest, worst behaved actors like True Leave, for example, major multi-billion-dollar federally illegal marijuana company based in Florida, with a lot of products they're selling, a lot of money that they have. If you were to enforce federal law against an entity like that is actively targeting younger demographics, I mean, it's not even debatable. You look at the products and the flavors that they're selling. I think 90% of America would have zero qualms with a company that's engaged in that kind of behavior, that's doing that kind of work, being enforced upon in some way. And what happens is if you take out the biggest, worst actors, then you start to decrease the number of products available in the market. Then the price starts to go up on these products, which then reduces the use. So you start to pare down this industry, the magnitude of the harm. So I think that is a very smart place to start if you're looking at federal enforcement of this, where you're not targeting individual users, you're not going after the cancer patients that are using the marijuana. They think it helps them with their appetite or their whatever it is. You're going after the large corporate conglomerates, with the big investors from Wall Street, from Silicon Valley. There's nobody that is, people are going to cry crocodile tears over those guys paying for selling addictive products. So I think that actually is a place where you could get a foothold. And then certainly if you have a state that votes to repeal their law or some part of their law, then you have a wide open door to go into a state and start doing something. I'm not hearing you, Pascal. I think you're on mute.
Yes,
Okay.
I was on mute. There's Palladium magazine. I don't know if
I
it's
know
a
of it.
yeah, it's a Silicon Valley magazine. Well, they did a very good piece on China and drugs. And basically, what the story they tell is in the early 2000s, China was beginning to get rich, and so they were starting to have problems with. It was more like party drugs like ecstasy and so on and so forth. And back then, certainly, if today, but back then, certainly, they thought of themselves as this sort of like benevolent, technocratic, non-ideological sort of ruling class, and so, and they still had an inferiority complex with vis-a-vis the U.S., and so they sort of looked at like American academic papers which said, "Oh, you can't ban drugs, but you have to offer support and treatment and prevention and so on and so forth." And they tried that for a year, and obviously, it had no results. And so they remembered that they're Chinese communists. Uh, and they went in the opposite direction, which is that they actually enforced the law, and they actually enforced it. So you had like SWAT raids and nightclubs, people grabbed off the street and tested, and so on and so forth, and it totally worked. This is something that really, it's the same thing about the border, right? It's like people pretend that it's impossible to enforce laws when literally all you have to do is enforce the law. Um, so I just wanted to get that out there. Okay, we're over time, but I really, if it's okay with you, I want to get to our last topic.
Let's do it.
Um, it was such a fascinating conversation. So one of the things that you and I both know, is that there is a lot of money behind this, and there is a lot of money in particular going to Republicans and so-called conservatives. And there is a very concerted, very well-funded, not just lobbying, but sort of broader influence operation going on by this industry to sort of essentially buy the Republican Party. Uh, Talk about that.
Let's definitely talk about that. So first of all, I think, not a lot of people know that there obviously, I think we've all heard that there's money in politics and money buys you power in DC and all of those things. So I think conceptually people know that. But at the nuts and bolts of how this works, it's interesting how the game has changed. So what we essentially have happening today, and I'll just obviously we're talking about marijuana. So the way that this is working right now is there's a concerted effort to leverage the Trump administration into rescheduling marijuana. That's what they want to get done. They know that they're not going to legalize it, that it won't be Trump who will legalize it, but they think they can get him to reschedule it, which will at least give them a windfall of cash in terms of a huge tax break. And so what they're doing is they have set up super PACs. Super PACs are these entities that can spend unlimited sums of money on advertising. They can push and attack and promote things that they want to promote, but they can also pay people to advocate their messages. And so what we're seeing is we have several of the largest marijuana companies, but I'm going to pick on Trulieve. Trulieve, who I talked about earlier, is probably they're the biggest in terms of being involved with this administration. And it's important to understand the ties. Before I talk about what they're doing, it's important to understand the ties. So Trulieve, major marijuana company from Florida, they hired a major law firm and lobbying firm in Florida. And that firm, one of the partners of that firm was Susie Wiles. And Susie Wiles, as everyone knows, is President Trump's chief of staff. And she was engaged in lobbying on behalf of Trulieve before she took the job at the Trump campaign and then became the chief of staff. So there's a connection between Susie Wiles, at least on paper, and I will not prognosticate as to anything further than that, but certainly there are dots connected between Susie Wiles and the Florida marijuana game, specifically Trulieve. Well, the CEO of Trulieve is Kim Rivers. Kim Rivers is she's one of the richest federal felons, or excuse me, who should be charged with a felony, but she's engaged in the felonious activity of pushing marijuana products right now. Hasn't been enforced against or convicted of anything, but in my view, she should be. She has been actively involved in the Trump administration. So she got a meeting with President Trump, which I think was courtesy of Susie Wiles, on the campaign trail to talk to Trump about supporting marijuana rescheduling, which for those who remember, he then ended up doing a Truth Social message about how he would support marijuana rescheduling on the campaign trail. And that was after this meeting with Kim Rivers. Fast forward, now we've learned that Kim Rivers and her associated Trulieve entities have given a couple $1 million to the Trump campaign and to election campaigns. So that's how the money's playing on the campaign side. Now we're learning that this super PAC that Trulieve and a couple of other major marijuana companies started and gave millions of dollars to has now paid conservative ex-influencers like Alec Brusewitz and his company X Strategies. They paid him $300,000 last month to promote marijuana rescheduling. So all of a sudden, this guy who's never said anything about marijuana policy, at least that I've seen, all of a sudden he's tweeting very interesting policy tweets about how we should reschedule marijuana. And oddly enough, his first tweet, he says, "I have no personal stake in this debate. However, I think we should reschedule marijuana." And that was 12 days after he received
Right.
$300,000 from the PAC that was designed to push marijuana
Right.
rescheduling. And then all of a
Right.
sudden, And it was very interesting. It was very, like very focused grouped in terms of what was in his text. Then all of a sudden, or
Yeah,
in
of
his
course.
tweets. Then all of a sudden, we see several other ex-influencers, conservative ex-influencers, doing the same thing and retweeting him. So
Yeah,
Gunther Eagleman, DC Drano, Bruce Lavelle, and I think there might be one other one, but that was the main core group. And so clearly, they're all being paid to say the exact same thing. And then you have Kim Rivers and the True Leave social media accounts retweeting these like, oh, interesting, like conservative influencers saying this, as if they're not the ones paying for the whole thing happening, which is
right.
clearly what's going on. So there's a lot more that goes to it. There's ways that they route dark money through LLCs, et cetera, and all of that happens. But I think it's important for people to understand, that old adage, if you shouldn't believe everything you read, you shouldn't believe everything you watch. Still true today as it relates to social media influencers, where you have to understand that they're not always saying things that they genuinely, authentically believe. A lot of times, these folks are being paid to put what are look like organic posts. And this happens with products and everything else as well. They're being paid to push a message. And that's absolutely what is happening. And we have the receipts. So we actually have a whole article on it on our thedrugreport.org. You can go to thedrugreport.org. That's our news service on drugs. And we have a whole article tying this all together with the FEC receipts and all of that stuff in terms of how this is happening. But there is a money game that's being played. And the final thing I'll say is there is rumor out there. And again, this is pure rumor. I have several friends very close to the industry, very close in True Leave, that I believe when they told me this. There's a rumor that the leadership of the Republican Party and Trump are being promised by Kim Rivers and True Leave that if they let this rescheduling decision move forward, they will put $400 million into the reelection campaigns for Republicans here in the midterms. That's the rumor around the industry and with some of the industry folks. So my hope is that the convictions and doing the right thing will outweigh the purported financial benefits, but we will see.
Yeah, just to clarify one thing about Susie Wells, just because somebody is a partner in firm X and a company hires that firm does not mean that that person
Correct.
works for that company.
Well,
Because
she lobbied. We know in her disclosures she did lobby on marijuana in Florida,
okay,
so we know
okay,
she was engaged. We know that she has a relationship. But to your point, we don't know the extent of that relationship today, and we don't know
okay,
what exactly that means. All I can point to is that on paper there's a connection, and that there was a meeting that was set up between the president himself and the CEO of that company. And there's
okay.
really only one person in the administration that could have set up a meeting for that CEO of that company that would have that relationship. But yes, a conjecture from there forward.
Uh, no, just because most of these firms work kind of like law firms, where like each partner has like his clients, and they share like brands and offices and accountants and stuff like that. But like it's sort of siloed inside, and I just want to be careful because otherwise Susie Wiles will have me shot. No, no. Joking aside, I really hate when, and I'm not saying you did this. I just want to be very clear for the audience. I hate the game of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. I hate so and so is the brother-in-law of so and so who was at the wedding, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make that very clear. Apart from that, everything you just said is 100% true, and I can absolutely confirm it. It's disgusting. It's pay to play, um, and it just goes completely against the values of the Republican Party, and not just because it's because you could say, oh well, the Republican Party, you have social conservatives, but you also have libertarians, and blah blah blah. Well, okay, but like it one of the bedrock values of the Republican Party that everybody is supposed to share is law and order, and it's become a law and order problem. I mean, this is why I
Totally
wanted to
agree.
ask you the devil's advocate point, which is no, it's no longer an individual liberty thing, because the spillover, number one, the addiction effects, and number two, the sort of spillover effects on the broader society are too large. And so I don't see how you can run an election on like the borders and the cartels and fentanyl uh, and China and generally the sort of the chaos of like blue governance, which was I think a huge factor. and do this. And by the way, I think it would be bad politics exactly for the reason I've laid out. Like there are probably some Trump moderates who are like, hey, but I bet there are more Trump leaning moderates who are just fed up of smelling marijuana smoke when they go out. So thank you for being willing to say the truth on this. Okay, so we end every podcast with a traditional ritual question. And the question is, recommend a book. It can be any book, fiction, nonfiction, old, new, that's not in your area of expertise.
The history of
So
the
no,
Peloponnesian
not
War.
drugs, not drug policy, not vice policy.
So I would recommend a book, The History of the Peloponnesian War. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's fantastic. It's one of my favorites. I'm a Greek, and the way I connect with my Greek heritage is to read the ancient Greek writers that our founding forefathers gleaned all their ideas about democracy and justice and virtue from. And I take that credit even before the Romans stole what my ancestors thought of. And so I will be a little facetious there. But no, The History of the Peloponnesian War is one of my favorite books. And it tells you a lot of things about the rules of engagement, about strategy, about right and wrong. There's a lot of
Oh
things that you
yeah,
can pull from that book. So yeah, that's
it
what I'd recommend. Mm.
it's one of the great books of the canon. Excellent, excellent selection. All right. Luke Niforatos, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for going a little bit over. But as you see, it was a fascinating discussion with enormous ground to cover. It was very interesting. Thank you. And, we'll keep covering this topic because it is an important topic. And there is, as we said, like a big bush on it.
Very good, Pascal. Thank you for the honor of being on here, and au revoir.
Au revoir.